years and can't find him. Some doofus jerk-off reporter with a camera crew waltzes right into his hideout and interviews him. Now, that tells us two things. Either everyone in the intelligence community and all of the intelligence agencies of the United States government are blithering idiots and incompetent fools, including the entire apparatus of the FBI and all of their personnel, or they're lying to us. They're not looking for him at all.
This is very reminiscent to me of Ed Snowden's situation, who was supposedly living in temporary asylum in Russia to evade capture by the Americans, who supposedly want to arrest him for espionage charges. If you believe that, you really will believe anything. How is it possible for a British comedian to find Ed Snowden in Russia and interview him? Don't you think the CIA would have found him first, even if he is in Russia? Do you really think the Russian government is protecting Snowden? It is all theatre, and of course the Russians are compliant with the script. As Lenin once said, the best way to control the opposition is to lead it ourselves, and that is exactly what the CIA are doing with Assange and Snowden. They are not whistleblowers, they are actors. Julian Assange has actually stated that there was no conspiracy involved in 9/11. You heard that right, folks. No conspiracy with 9/11. If you ever visit Berlin, please make sure you take a dog with you so you can let it piss on these statues. They are a joke. Assange was even given a TV show on the disinformation news channel Russia Today, which is now a cesspit of half-truths and diversion, clearly being made by the West for the West. As far as I am aware, Assange is not wanted by the US government at all, but the media does everything to make you think he is in order to raise his profile, and also uses actors holding up CIA posters to fool people into thinking this is a real issue. Okay, so I'm drawing a parallel there with what Bill Cooper said about Osama bin Laden and about how, well, if the media can get close to him, why the hell can't intelligence agencies? So do you want to...
Yeah, absolutely. And I think later on we're going to discuss this interview, or the two interviews. I think you watched the same ones that I did. And the first one I watched was the one by John Pilger, which was done, I think, in November 2016. And I actually thought, you know, the comment you made there about the Bill Cooper commentary on Osama bin Laden being interviewed, that was one of the thoughts that was, you know, in my mind when I was watching this John Pilger interview, that he's in there in the Ecuadorian embassy doing this interview. Again, it seemed to have some sort of vague parallels there.
All right, so we're going to go try and chart some of the life of Julian Assange, which isn't easy. Seems to be shrouded in mystery, a lot of his childhood and his adolescence and his working life. But let's go right back to his childhood. Apparently, he never knew his real father, and the story is that when he was a young boy, aged just 8, his mother divorced, and she married another man, or became romantically involved with another man that they had a child with when Assange was 8 years old, and his name was Leif Meynell. But this guy was a musician, and he was also connected to or part of a cult called The Family. Now, there's actually a film being made all about this cult, operating in the Melbourne area of Australia, I believe, run by this woman called Anne Hamilton Byrne, who I think died fairly recently.
Yes.
And Anne Hamilton Byrne, this sort of blonde-haired, attractive woman in the 1960s, she set up this cult which acquired over 500 disciples, and she was controlling all of these other people's children, basically. Do you want to make an observation on that?
Yeah, I mean,
we'll show a clip on it.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll show the clip. And I'd heard about this before, you know, we proposed this program, or you proposed this program. And, you know, I heard about this alleged cult connection with Assange, but I didn't know the details. Just to add something I picked up from a Guardian article, that Assange's parents ran a touring theatre company, and he went to 37 different schools, according to this article from The Guardian. So yeah, very unusual sort of background. And as we're going to come on to, these cults seem to have certain traits that basically, you know, involve a form of mind control, because that's essentially what the cult is. This way of forcing people to think in a certain way and behave in a certain way because of abuse or threats of violence, or etc. Deprivation. And this one was pretty extreme, wasn't it? This particular cult.
Now calls for compensation for the children of notorious cult The Family, whose childhood was marred by daily abuse. Tonight, its former guru lies on her deathbed. Despite the efforts of police, she was never held accountable for the pain she inflicted on the children of the sinister sect.
I love children.
It was eerie. This was where some of the worst crimes were committed, allegedly, against the children.
No kid should ever have to put up with what we did.
This is the moment of rebirth upon a new planet.
Allegations of child theft at birth, the administration of a drug, LSD, to children. You start to think, I can't walk away from this.
She is a sociopathic monster.
They called themselves The Family, but this was no ordinary family.
We weren't allowed to be children. We were designed kids.
Their motto, unseen, unheard, unknown. But this bizarre cult is now world-renowned, as more details of what went on inside it are uncovered.
Everything was taken away from us children. Everything you can think of.
Tonight we'll show you the never-before-seen police interviews.
Did you want to speak to your solicitor again? Or try to ring him again?
You'll hear from the dogged detective who wants to see change.
But was justice totally done? No.
And there's calls for Australia's lost children, now adults, to get the proceeds from this cult leader's estate, reportedly worth up to $10 million.
I think the people who have been damaged should be compensated. They're doing it tough.
No, that's really beautiful, that, honey.
Anne Hamilton-Byrne looked like an enchanting movie star, charismatic and beautiful. But that smile masked what's been described as evil incarnate.
In my time in policing, she is the most evil person I've ever known.
Here in Melbourne's Lake Eildon, up to 28 children were collected by Anne in a sick bid to create a kind of master race. Some of her 500 disciples helped convince mothers to adopt them out. They thought the kids were going to a good home. The reality was far from it.
We didn't have identities. We didn't have our correct names, our correct ages.
The children raised in this house of horrors were made to look picture perfect, donning neat little uniforms and matching hairstyles.
That was so that Anne could adopt more people into her cult, get more followers.
Anne Hamilton-Byrne is now a frail 96-year-old in palliative care. As her life comes to an end, former sect members are asking what will happen to her massive fortune.
We didn't have everything that we needed. We had most things.
There's quite a lot of money in her estate, and I believe it's time that this case was reopened and that the money that's left in her estate should be distributed to the people that she harmed in the course of establishing this cult.
Anne wanted to look like she was an incredible mother with this number of children, well-dressed, well-behaved. Propaganda is all it was for.
Anna Ray Trina Byrne, who grew up in the sect, knows that behind the Von Trapp family facade was a fearful existence.
We were a team of children trying to live without kind people.
Adam Lanchester, another of the cult children, punished on a daily basis.
Beltings, no food, Auntie Anne and my mum, Elizabeth Whittaker, held my hands and burnt it with a cigarette lighter in front of all the other kids.
Living in Lake Eildon, what was that like for you?
Hell. Hell on earth.
Anne would recruit mostly suburban housewives and some of society's highest flyers.
Doctors, we're talking nurses, we're talking barristers, solicitors. There were so many bizarre stories about who she was. We had to drill down and get the facts.
A new documentary called The Family, filmed over 3 years, is revealing new case details. Director Rosie Jones.
It's a story about family, about love, betrayal, loyalty.
I was in the sector from 1971 until September 1985.
The film includes police interviews with the children shortly after they escaped, as well as cult members.
Dan came across and said to me, it's time that you got married and had a child.
How long after you've been initiated was this?
Only for a couple of days.
So this is basically about 10 days after you first met her?
Yeah, I didn't have time to think.
I had been taught that police and other outsiders would hurt us, and that men would want to rape us.
This is Leanne Crease today.
We didn't have a childhood, so we were abused every day. I don't call that childhood.
She spent 16 long years living under Anne's reign and was the first to escape.
I was given LSD when I was 14. It was a form of what in the sect as a whole was called going through. It was when we became supposedly initiated into the inner sanctum.
I believed in them and something had to be done. Anne had to be stopped.
Former police officer Lex DeMann headed Operation Forest, the task force commissioned to investigate the family. He says the drug LSD was an essential ingredient for this cult.
And when they were administered the LSD at night and the room was dark, Anne would appear at the doorway with a bright light behind her, with, would you believe, dry ice in a bucket behind her. And so through the hallucinatory process, they would wake up and they would believe they have seen Jesus Christ.
In the late 80s, police raided the compound and rescued the children. Anne and her husband Bill fled Australia.
Mari Moore from Channel 9.
The community was absolutely shocked. They couldn't believe that those children had been locked away and treated like they were, and nobody noticed.
Former current affair journalist Mari Moore hunted them down in Hawaii.
Can you explain to me why you treated the children like you did? And Bill, if you'd like to give explanations as to your involvement in why the children were locked away. I've got nothing to say to you.
But I think in her delusional way, she really thought she could convince people that she was fine, that she was a good woman.
Eventually, police had the family leader extradited for her day in court, but she was only fined a measly $5,000.
We've got to be very conscious and on our guard always to make sure that this type of behaviour is never allowed to occur again.
We are doing well under the circumstances, but I will argue that we are all struggling.
And those scars do live within you forever.
I'm in awe of the resilience that they've shown through what they've gone through.
Hello, how are you?
Recently, a huge moment for Adam as he reconnected for the first time with his blood relatives.
They're my everything at the moment. Slowly, we're really bonding as a family, as a family should be.
That documentary, The Family, screens in select theatres from tomorrow.
And Anne Hamilton Byrne used LSD as well on her subjects and would deprive them of light, and similar to the isolation tanks used in MK Ultra programs.
And she had a particular predilection for certain types of children, didn't she? That's also what I didn't, and that's why, you know, because people say, no, this Assange cult story could be just a made-up rumour, you know, we don't know for sure. Well, but there's a few things, isn't there?
I think the contention is how closely Assange was linked to the cult. Let me just come on to that then. So this woman would, if the child didn't already have blonde hair, they would have their hair dyed blonde and cut in a certain way so they all look the same. And she was running this cult from the 1960s right up to the late 1980s. Now, there's been a documentary which has come out which exposes all of the crimes of this cult. So that is a long time to be running such an organisation without actually being arrested or whatever. So that then brings the question, well, was she being supported because she'd never been prosecuted or brought to justice for her supposed crimes? And the other thing is that information that came out of the investigation was made top secret. So we have to ask, was there an intelligence agency involved in assisting? And also I believe that certain people involved in psychiatry were involved in the cult as well. So was it a covert intelligence operation probably being run by the CIA or some other organisation?
This is the sort of thing, and particularly in that news clip that we reviewed earlier on, they were actually talking about where these children came from, the children that went into the cult, and they mentioned that they were like, you know, quite wealthy people, doctors, they mentioned nurses, and they're known for being wealthy, but in other words, if some of the children were drawn from elite families, then that, you know, ties into some of the other people like, you know, these pop stars that have, you know, like Lady Gaga, and quite a lot of them have come children from wealthy backgrounds and so forth. So you've got similar, you know, things happening in the basis of how those cults are being populated.
Now let's just come on to the contention as to whether Assange was closely involved in this cult. So his stepfather, who was definitely involved in the cult, came on the scene when he was 8 years old. Now when he was 11 years old, Assange's mother fell out with her partner and then wanted to flee the family home, and she was worried that the father was going to get custody. So the claim is that they were on the run from this guy when Assange was between the ages of 11 and 16. They're trying to get away from this guy because they didn't like what he was doing and what have you, right? So for 3 years, presumably, he was on the scene between Assange at the ages of 8 and 11. Now, both of us, when we watched this clip, we're watching these little blonde children with tracksuits on, all dressed the same. We both picked out a person we thought, is that Assange?
Right, yeah, there's one particular child, I don't know if we'll put the clip in here, but it's from an Australian news broadcast review of this new film, isn't it? The family, it's about 8 minutes long. And yeah, there's one child that particularly runs towards the camera, and you know, we were discussing and looking at the clip, it's probably going to be sort of early 80s, mid 80s. Assange was born in 74, so that would put it in the right time frame. You know, potentially we didn't check the date of the clip, but it is very peculiar. I know we're kind of just sort of speculating here, but we both had the same thought at the same time, didn't we?
Yeah, and let's just say that Assange was an absolute member of the cult from the age of 8 up to 16. Let's just say that was the case, that he was part of this cult, right? You've got to account for where he was when he wasn't in the cult. So a great cover story would be, he travelled around and he went to 37 different schools. So that means you're never going to find a friend or a colleague who can say, yeah, I was sitting next to him at school, because there's so many of them.
Yeah.
So is it the case that he was part of this cult right the way up until his sort of mid-teens? And they weren't really on the run.
Yeah.
So who knows? Now, if we can just mention perhaps at this point a little bit about Assange's character and his mannerisms.
Yeah, he's kind of, he doesn't express much emotion, and he's very sort of curt with his responses. And this Guardian article, which I read from 2010, makes that sort of comment that, you know, I think that there's a comment made in this Guardian article that when you're with Julian Assange, you know, having dead air is not, he doesn't worry about there being dead air. You know, in other words, he's not very forthcoming with his conversation.
Yeah, his social intercourse is a bit abnormal.
Yes.
And is that a result of being part of a cult or involved in a mind control program? All right, and the other thing about, let's say it was the CIA that were backing that cult, or using it as a research project or whatever, using Australia as a foreign nation, that gives them another layer of deniability. And also having the cutout of Anne Hamilton Byrne, she provides the deniability for an intelligence agency running that. And that would explain why she's never been prosecuted.
Right.
All right.
And there was one other clip that caught my attention again, speculation, but they showed this clip of them stood at the reporter stood outside the Freemasons hospital.
Yeah. So Anne Hamilton Byrne, in her old age, she lived to a very old age, has been nursed in a Freemason hospital.
But then again, I have to point out that she was, I think, quite a wealthy woman, wasn't she? And they talked about having a lot of money in her estate when she died and this sort of thing. So,
Another thing I read was that he lived for a time on an island called Magnetic Island off the coast in Queensland.
Yes. Yeah.
Not sure if that's of any significance.
Very strange.
So if we go forward in time a bit to his, his late teens, let's say, Assange was born in 1974, and according to Wikipedia, and just to reiterate, I don't read from Wikipedia because it represents truth. I read from Wikipedia because that's what they're trying to get people to believe. There may be some truth in what I'm about to read. So according to Wikipedia, he started hacking in 1987 under the name of Mendax. So his first sort of work experience, if you like, is in computer hacking. Not that that's actual work. So in 87 he would be 74, only 13, right? He and two others known as Trax and Prime Suspect formed a hacking group they called the International Subversives. During this time, he hacked into the Pentagon and other US defense facilities, allegedly, Milnet, US Navy, blah, blah, blah. Right? And so why didn't he get an extradition request like Gary McKinnon? You have to wonder that, don't you?
Right.
So in 1991, Assange was discovered hacking into the Melbourne Master Terminal of Nortel, a Canadian multinational telecommunications corporation. The Australian Federal Police tapped Assange's phone line while he was using a modem. So 1991, he's still going to be in his teens, probably 17, I think, something like that. Raided his home at the end of October and eventually charged him in 1994, so it took 3 years for them to bring charges, with 31 counts of hacking and related crimes. So that's from quite a young sort of mid-teens up to his, he's probably in his early 20s by the time he gets prosecuted. In December 1996, he pleaded guilty to 25 charges. The other 6 were dropped. He was ordered to pay reparations of Australian dollars 2,100 and released on a good behaviour bond, avoiding a heavier penalty resulting from the perceived absence of malicious or mercenary intent and his disrupted childhood. So the court acknowledged, according to this, that he had a disrupted childhood. Now, if we move forward from then, his sort of very early computer hacking days, which seems quite extensive according to that sounds to me like he was a real nuisance and not really trying to use computer hacking for any kind of good reason other than to cause mischief. From 1993 onwards, there's various things you can see on Wikipedia where he's written some open source software, or he's done a patch for this thing or that. But from 1993 up to, let's say, 99, it doesn't appear, there's no company you can pin down that he's working for through his career. He's also been involved in software piracy, allegedly.
Right.
So we were talking about open source, and he's claimed, or I've read that he has claimed that his code is in all Apple products, right? But I'm not aware that Apple actually acknowledged this. So just tell us about open source software and how, because you know obviously a lot about software, how open source software is developed and what that means?
Well, generally, the way that it's worked is that these days people can download the Linux operating system, which is a viable, perfectly usable operating system, which is free. It's an alternative to Windows and Mac OS. And the idea was that when that started in the early 90s with Linus Torvalds, you could then, he decided that he would write a new operating system. So he wrote some programs which were the sort of core modules of the operating system, and then he put them on the internet and said, here's my first version. Anybody that wants to improve my programs or add new programs to this collection along, with the same sort of themes to help expand the functions of the operating system can do that. Mm-hmm. So open source is where you publish the source code for your program, which can be C or assembly language or any programming language basically, and then other people will, for example, develop a utility, a disk utility or a graphics utility, and then somebody else might come on and add new features to that source code. And the reason that they can do that is that the source code is all public, it's open, in other words, open source. Anybody can add to it, improve the program, add new features. And so allegedly we're told Assange was doing that as he probably taught himself how to program, and he was then doing that with code which may have ended up as part of Apple's operating system, perhaps, we don't know.
Well, I don't think Apple develops their code through open source.
No.
Right?
No.
So I don't see how he could have written for Apple unless he was working for Apple, right? One of the systems that I've used, OS Commerce, which is an open source system, it's incredible how software actually still works when it's developed in an open source way. It has to be made very, very modular so that if a bug does get in there, it can, that module can be dropped or replaced or what have you.
Right.
But anyway, we'll start talking about software now.
Yes.
But the point being that, for example, if I go through my career, I can tell you the names of the company that I worked for between which years. There doesn't appear to have that sort of traceability on Assange's CV.
And I mean, when an employer sees a gap on your CV or your resume, as they call it in the US, they'll home in on that. They'll want to know what you were doing in that gap.
Yeah, well, one gap appears to be, and viewers can correct me if they can fill it in or inform me if they can fill it in, between 1999, when he claims that he registered a domain name called leaks.org. So supposedly, and I don't know if this is true because I've checked the domain registration and it doesn't have his name on it that I could see. He was interested in leaks in 99. That's the official story. I'm not saying I believe that. In 2006, so between 1999 and 2006, or the end of 2006, when Wikileaks was set up, what was he doing in that time? I don't know. If we just look at another thing in his past, in 1994, and it's in this book by Daniel Estulin, there's actually an email that Assange wrote to a NASA employee called Fred Blonder, and it was also copied in to somebody at Los Alamos Laboratories. And at the time of Assange's email, Fred Blonder was working on a cybersecurity program called the NASA Automated Systems Incident Response Capability. So it looks as though Assange was assisting in some way, whether that be in an open source way. I can't imagine it was in a true open source fashion if he's working for NASA and Los Alamos Labs, but he was in the, I mean, I'll not read it out, it's a bit geekish, the email, but it's to do with cybersecurity or program security, right?
Okay.
So now there's another person, let's just read this, called Peter Zatko. Now Peter Zatko started working for DARPA, I think, in 2010. So DARPA is the Defense
Advanced Research Projects Association,
who were involved in a very early version of the internet.
That's right.
So they developed computer and other cyber-related technologies to do with connected to defense. So I'm just going to read this out. So there's a computer club in Germany called the Chaos Computer Club, which would have conferences. I was in Germany for Chaos Congress in 2009, a hacker conference. And after attending a series of talks, I was headed back to my hotel when I spotted Julian Assange. This predated my working as a project manager at DARPA as a hacker in residence, if you will. So he was employed by DARPA because he was a hacker the following year after he's at this computer conference, this guy, Peter Zatko. It was also before WikiLeaks released the video Collateral Murder, which we'll come on to, and hundreds of thousands of diplomatic cables, the Swedish rape allegations, and Julian ending up a virtual prisoner holed up in Ecuador's diplomatic mission. So in other words, what he's saying is, oh, Julian Assange was kind of okay when I spoke to him at this point, yeah? So he's trying to, what he's insinuating there is, oh, I would never have spoken to him if I'd known he was going to do all that. So given that I hadn't seen Julian in more than a decade, so he knew Julian Assange in 1999, I greeted him and we agreed to grab some dinner and a catch-up. After reminiscing about the old gang, he and I had been part of the same hacker milieu, as Julian would say. I asked why he had skipped out on the hacking scene to form WikiLeaks. Last I heard, Julian had left to study mathematics and physics at the University of Melbourne. He was working on a duress-based crypto file system, also known as the rubber hose file system. So that would be, I think, in 1997.
Okay.
Right? So he's gone. If he has gone to Melbourne University to study mathematics and physics, then he's gone there a little bit late. Because if he was born in 1974, 84, 94...
He was only 25 in 99, so it's a mature student sort of getting to...
Julian told me his graduate work had been funded by a US government grant, specifically NSA and DARPA money, which was supposed to be used for fundamental security research. It was a time when the Bush administration and Department of Defense were seen to be classifying a great deal of fundamental research and pulling back on university funds. So it's possibly got links to the NSA at that point. From 99 onwards up to 2006, I can't see what he was doing.
Right.
But he's had possible ties to NASA, Los Alamos, and the NSA in the mid to late 90s. So here you have a non-US citizen at a foreign university doing graduate work studies, and the United States government came barreling in and not only snuffed out the funding and killed his studies, it also barred him from knowing what it was he had been funded to research. So you see, depending on who you ask, the US government actually helped create WikiLeaks, and the rest, as they say, is history. So, yeah.
Some very dodgy connections there, you know, by the sounds of it. If that seems to fit with everything else we're going to discuss at some level fairly closely.
Okay. So we come now to the launch of WikiLeaks, which was in December 2006. And something which really raises alarm bells for me is that the Washington Post and Time magazine, they wrote articles about WikiLeaks, so promoting WikiLeaks effectively, telling us what was to come. Before any significant leaks had come out, they're bigging up this organisation in the mainstream press. Now, if you're a new media organisation, which is what WikiLeaks are, new online newspaper or whatever it might be, normally you would have to build up a customer base by spending money on advertising or promotion in some way or other. So do you want to just comment on that, Andrew?
Well, absolutely. I mean, you quite rightly made the analogy with an organisation perhaps like UK Column or Rich Planet itself, in that you need to make people aware of what you are doing. So you have to have a way of doing that, and one way is to start a regular update service. And maybe then Facebook wasn't as prominent as it is now and everything, but you could still. I think Google AdWords was sort of in operation by that sort of time. But anyway, however you do it, you're going to need to build up a regular updates and maybe have an RSS feed on your site so that you can feed updates to that and people can subscribe to that feed and get the updates. But
unless you've got the mainstream media doing it for you.
Unless you've got the mainstream media doing it for you, which, as you rightly pointed out, seemed to be the way that WikiLeaks immediately started to operate. Right.
So before they've even gained any sort of reputation or credibility whatsoever, they're bigging up WikiLeaks, right? And by March, but after that point, by March 2007, they'd allegedly leaked 1 million documents within 3 months of starting. So,
and that's a lot of documents.
Yeah. So, but how did anyone know about WikiLeaks to give them the
those million documents? Yeah. In other words, where did those 1 million documents come from? That's who has access to 1 million documents to leak. You know.
And we are going to come on to people who've commented on that, such as John Young, in a moment.
Right.
So throughout the WikiLeaks life, as we've said, it's had help from mainstream media. And the main publications have been the New York Times in the US, The Guardian in the UK, and Der Spiegel in America, and also The Economist. I mean, these are just establishment arse-licking organizations that are not, they're not guardians of truth. They're architects of disinformation.
Right, and I mean, I didn't really investigate WikiLeaks much at all. I had no interest in it and I think it was primarily because we're going to talk about Julian Assange's comment about 9/11, aren't we? And by the time that WikiLeaks came out, I already knew about 9/11, and therefore, to me, the WikiLeaks should be leaking information about 9/11, but it never has. But what was interesting was, I think in a previous conversation I had with you, or in similar conversations I had with other people, I felt that what they were doing with WikiLeaks, and it was essentially a psychological operation, and I felt that it was changing the way that they were going to get people to perceive the news and where the news stories came from. In other words, it was going to come out of a secretive organisation where you couldn't really get, you know, the name of the person that gave you the story, because, you know, and interestingly, you mentioned The Guardian a minute ago. When I was reading up, you know, when we'd agreed to do this discussion, I found an article from 2010 from the Guardian, and it actually says at the top, and I never read this before a few days ago, Julian Assange, the whistleblower, Julian Assange, founder of WikiLeaks, may just represent the future of news reporting, but he's not a journalist. So that was exactly what I thought. In other words, The Guardian seemed to be admitting to me, as I read it, that WikiLeaks was a psychological operation.
So they know that they're losing out in print media and TV media. People are getting more and more information from the internet. So someone is going to define how that's going to work.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So you mentioned 9/11. So let's give the Julian Assange's quote on 9/11. So I'm just going to read it from this book. So the Belfast Telegraph interviewed Julian Assange on July the 19th. I'm not sure what year that was, but he stated, "Anytime people with power plan in secret, they are conducting a conspiracy." So there are conspiracies everywhere. There are also crazed conspiracy theories. It's important not to confuse these two. So the interviewer then asks him, what about 9/11? "I'm constantly annoyed that people are distracted by false conspiracies, such as 9/11, when all around we provide evidence of real conspiracies for war or mass financial fraud." Very non-specific.
Absolutely.
Yeah. "What about the Bilderberg conference?" the interviewer asks. "That is vaguely conspiratorial in a networking sense," Assange claims. "We have published their meeting notes, and as have other people published their meeting notes." So, to suggest that there was no conspiracy involved in 9/11, what planet is he living on?
Right.
And who is he really working for?
Right. I mean, if he is clearly an intelligent person, despite whatever background he may have had. If you listen to the interviews, he's quite articulate, and he does understand how politics operates, and he even more or less says that the two-party system in the US is a joke. He doesn't put it in those terms, but if you listen to the whole interviews, he knows that is is just another puppet show, really. So why doesn't he go the whole hog, so to speak?
Mm-hmm. I mean, you mentioned there about him being politically aware. You read in some of his emails where he talks about the importance of language and using certain words in certain phraseology in order to influence lots of people. So he'll say, well, we don't use the word hacking, we put the word ethical before it, or ethical leaking. Leaking can have a negative connotation. Ethical leaking changes it. So Dr. Judy Wood has spoken about this in very careful use of language. And as you say, when he's interviewed, he's never in a hurry or pressed for an answer, and he always considers his words just like a politician. So how did he become so proficient, sounding like a politician with this computer hacking background?
14 pages about this topic. Also concurrently in the Spiegel, 17 pages. The New York Times, I'm not sure how many, International Herald Tribune, and I believe the Telegraph also has it on the front page, and I haven't checked into the others.
What do you say when people like the White House accuse you of compromising the security of troops in Afghanistan by virtue of this massive leak?
Yeah. We're familiar with groups whose abuse we expose, attempting to criticize the messenger to distract from the power of the message. And we don't see any difference in the White House's response to this case to the other groups that we have exposed.
Can you then therefore answer the question that's been asked twice already by a journalist? You mentioned the word crimes. Can you please just be a bit more specific about what you meant by are these crimes committed within these documents? Because unless the question's answered, how do you expect the media to take you seriously down the line when there are potentially more good stories to come out?
What is your specific question?
You mentioned a while ago war crimes or crimes when you were talking about the documents. You weren't specific. What I'm asking you is to be more specific when you talk about war crimes, or crimes is I think the word you used.
I think I was speaking about the issue in general. However, it is up to a court to decide clearly whether something is in the end a crime. That said, prima facie, there does appear to be evidence of war crimes in this material. An example is the Task Force 373 HIMARS missile strike on a house which killed 7 children.
You find an average computer hacker, right? They don't speak like that. They're not so well trained in this art of political speaking.
Political discourse,
Yeah,
that's right.
yeah.
Yeah.
So where's he been trained on that? And to be able to hold his own in these, not that he's actually ever taken part in a proper critical interview. We'll mention the interviews he has taken part in. And I've just made a few notes here from something that I was listening to on the internet, that the leaks on the whole have not damaged the imperialist agenda that the US is running in their war campaigns.
Right.
But it has helped to, let's say, discredit Iran or reveal alleged Iran's nuclear program. There's been nothing on any sort of Israeli nuclear program or crimes. It's helped destabilize Pakistan. And one of the things that the leaks have done is, okay, it's revealed certain groups in Pakistan and Afghanistan as operating terrorist groups, but it's not found any link to US intelligence agencies, or the fact that US intelligence agencies are controlling, let's say, the Pakistani intelligence agency and this kind of thing. So it's very one-sided disclosures. It
is, and in fact, we're going to talk about the John Pilger interview, but that actually comes out in the Pilger interview. That's one of the notes that I made when I was listening to that Assange basically blames the formation of those, ISIL and ISIS groups on the Saudis. That's essentially what he does in that interview. So it's not really any different from what the US State Department itself has essentially been trying to do. You made this point, and it's horrible to kind of think about, but I think it is worth mentioning the video which really put WikiLeaks right at the forefront of everybody's minds was this where people were killed by this helicopter gunship shooting and missile attack, wasn't it? And you made this point about the way that's like having the horrible sort of head on a pole type thing, and I think it's worth you mentioning that.
Yeah, I'll just mention that. It was an analogy that I drew.
Yeah.
WikiLeaks released these videos I'm not sure if they came through Bradley Manning. I think they may have done.
Yes, I think they did come through him, didn't they? Yes.
Where you've got you can hear the voice of the helicopter pilot, and there's a whole load of people on the ground, and they're defenseless, and they're basically mowed down. They're just killed in total cold blood. It's sick. It's just sick. And WikiLeaks leaks this. But if it hadn't been leaked by WikiLeaks, then mainstream media, has it been shown on mainstream media? I think it has.
I think it has, but
that gave them license to show it because they weren't releasing it. They were just commenting on the fact that WikiLeaks have released it. So it's okay to now show this. And I made the analogy of, well, we've got an empire, the US empire, stroke Israeli empire. We've had empires in the past of total dictatorships where if someone steps out of line, you will get your head chopped off. Not only that, we'll stick it on a pole so everyone can see your head so that no one else acts in this way. Right? So it's using fear.
Yeah.
Does releasing those videos particularly damage the US agenda? Because it not necessarily.
No. No, I mean, it's showing that they can act with impunity, and any nation that wants to go up against them can expect that sort of treatment, you know, where they'll just go in and kill civilians, unarmed civilians, with impunity.
Yeah, it shows that international law doesn't apply to them.
Right.
So that's quite a scary thought.
Yeah.
And so is it really being released for this sort of open freedom of information reasons in order to prevent war? Because as far as I'm aware, I'm not sure how much Assange speaks about being anti-war. We need to stop all wars, like Nick Colostrom
does. That's right. I've
not heard him speak in those terms.
No, you know, and we hear of many stories of atrocities, you know, from people that have come back from war zones. But this was an actual time when it was actually blasted across the screens for everyone to see, an atrocity. So the way that then the global population perceives those atrocities has been altered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's take an example of a real whistleblower, Mordechai Vanunu, who found out about Israel's secret nuclear program, and he ended up in prison for 18 years, and most of you probably never heard about him. That's what happens to real whistleblowers. Right? You don't end up on the front page of the Sun, the Times and the Guardian simultaneously.
Yeah.
Because those who orchestrate cover-ups in the intelligence, they've got all their tentacles in the mainstream media.
And of course, going back to that video, Bradley Manning was prosecuted, wasn't he? I can't remember what happened to him. But then again, so if we're starting to shift the view of what WikiLeaks actually is from what the mainstream says to what we think it is. It's a way of presenting information to the public which is different to mainstream media.
It appears that it's possibly globalists that are behind the setting up of it and the sponsoring of it. Perhaps we can mention John Young, who 10 years before WikiLeaks was set up, was running a site called cryptome.org, which itself was leaking documents. Is that right, Andrew?
That's right, yes, it was indeed. And I came across quite a few links to this because, and this is where we sort of start to get a little bit into the Iceland connection. There was an initiative to try and set up a haven in Iceland. And I think John Young, who runs cryptome.org, which to me, when I looked at it, is kind of a more honest version of WikiLeaks, because when you get onto this idea of funding, Assange was asking for like $250,000 or $500,000 funding, and John Young, who was running Cryptome.org and was involved with Assange for a while, he says, "Well, hang on, why are you needing this sort of money? We don't need that sort of money to run a web server. You know, if you've got $10,000 a year, you can run a pretty decent web service for that, you know, with quite a lot of security and so forth." So, and there was quite a lot of discussion at that time, because I know that this Icelandic MP, Birgitta Jonsdóttir, she was involved with trying to get Assange